Welcome to the channel. Today, we drift into the frozen nightmare of the Soviet Gulag and discover what life was truly like behind the barbed wire. Please like, share, and subscribe for more history documentaries. Now, let's step into the story. Cold, silent, endless. Those are the first words that come to mind when trying to understand what life felt like for the millions of men and women who entered the Soviet Gulag system. Not just cold in the sense of winter, but a deeper cold, one that crept into the bones, the heart, and finally the soul. It was the kind of cold that didn't simply surround you, it swallowed you. For those who experienced it, the Gulag wasn't a single place. It was an entire hidden world scattered across frozen forests, desolate tundra, remote mountain valleys, and windswept plains where the horizon seemed to stretch forever. Camps were built far away from cities, intentionally invisible. They were placed where escape was almost impossible, where nature itself seemed to conspire with the guards. Even if someone broke through the barbed wire, what were they supposed to run toward? Thousands of miles of wilderness stood between them and civilization. The landscape became another prison wall. The Gulag system grew out of fear, ideology, and an unquenchable hunger for control. It was born in the years after revolution, when paranoia spread through the government and suspicion became policy. Leaders believed that enemies were everywhere, in factories, in villages, in offices, even among friends and family. And when fear becomes law, justice disappears. Arrests happened quietly, sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes in the middle of the night. A knock at the door, boots in the hallway, a commanding voice reading accusations written long before the prisoner ever saw them. People were told they were under investigation. Many still believed in fairness. They thought they could explain themselves, present reason, defend their innocence. But the Gulag did not grow out of reason. It grew from the idea that confession was more important than truth. The interrogations were relentless. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Prisoners were deprived of sleep, food, and hope. Some confessed simply because they could no longer endure the pressure. Others signed anything just to end the torture. Sentences were often predetermined anyway. 10 years, 15 years, 25. A lifetime disguised in numbers. Family members rarely received explanations. They were told to forget. Forget the name, forget the face, forget the existence of the person taken away. And in many cases, they had no choice. Once condemned, prisoners were transferred to holding cells, waiting for transport. They watched the world through tiny barred windows, listening to footsteps echo through damp corridors. Rumors passed from cell to cell, where they would be sent, how long they would work, what the conditions might be. But rumors weren't helpful. The reality was always worse. Eventually, the day came. Guards shouted names, or rather, numbers, and people were marched outside. They saw trucks, trains, convoys. Some carried small bundles, a piece of clothing, a book, maybe a photograph. Others carried nothing. Snow crunched beneath their feet as they moved toward a journey that felt more like exile than imprisonment. The trains used for deportation were not meant for people. They were meant for livestock or cargo. The cars were sealed, dark and filthy. Iron doors slammed shut from the outside, locking prisoners into tight spaces with barely any air. Wooden bunks lined the sides, though there were rarely enough for everyone. Those who arrived first claimed a spot. The others stood, leaning against one another as the train lurched forward. Sometimes the journey lasted days, sometimes weeks. There were no schedules, no explanations, just endless motion and the clattering sound of wheels on frozen rails. Inside the cars, the atmosphere changed quickly. The smell of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies filled the air. Buckets placed in corners served as toilets. When the train stopped wherever it happened to be, guards opened the doors for just a few minutes so waste could be thrown out and a ladle of water could be passed around. Food consisted of thin soup, maybe a crust of stale bread, not enough to ease hunger, just enough to keep prisoners alive. During the long nights, people whispered to one another. Some spoke about their families, their work, the lives they had left behind. Others wondered aloud whether they would ever return home, but as days passed, voices grew quieter, energy faded. Every prisoner slowly learned the first essential lesson of the Gulag: weakness was dangerous. Complaining drew attention. Asking questions angered guards. Showing vulnerability could attract those willing to exploit it. Silence became a shield. Eventually, the train would grind to a final halt. The doors opened to reveal a barren wilderness, white snow stretching endlessly, forests black with frost, rivers locked under sheets of ice. Guards shouted again, ordering men and women into lines. They marched, stiff and trembling, toward the camp. From a distance, the camps didn't look like much, just clusters of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. But the barbed wire told the real story. Double fences, watchtowers spaced evenly, each staffed by armed guards, searchlights casting long beams across the snow. Even the footprints around the perimeter seemed afraid. The gate was heavy, ironclad. Many prisoners later said the sound it made, the echo of it closing behind them, was the moment they truly realized they had entered another world, a world where laws existed, but not for them, a world in which survival itself was never guaranteed. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed like inventory. Their names were recorded, then often replaced by identification numbers. The number mattered, the person did not. Personal belongings were confiscated: wristwatches, wedding rings, letters. These objects, which once carried meaning, were now prohibited reminders of life before the camp. Prisoners were issued uniforms, usually war, now coats and boots already patched many times. Clothing was rarely the right size. Large boots filled with rags, coats too thin to block the wind, gloves, if provided, were shared between workers. Then came the barracks, long wooden structures arranged in rows. Inside, the air felt stagnant, thick with smoke from stoves that never seemed to burn hot enough. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of prisoners slept in each building. Bunk beds stacked 3 levels high lined the walls. Those lucky enough to sleep near the center stayed slightly warmer. Those near the edges felt every gust of wind seeping through the cracks. On cold nights, frost formed on the blankets, and prisoners awoke with icicles clinging to their eyelashes. The barracks were alive with noise, coughing, snoring, whispering, the creaking of beds, the scraping of boots. Yet beneath all that sound was a deeper silence, the silence of despair. People lay awake, staring into the darkness, thinking about the homes they had lost, the families left behind, the years stretching before them without end. Food rations were distributed by guards or camp overseers: a watery broth, a small lump of porridge, occasionally a piece of bread rationed by weight, cut carefully so that no one received more than they were assigned. Bread was the most precious thing in the camp. Prisoners protected it like treasure, hiding crumbs in pockets, eating slowly to make it last. The daily routine began early, at the first light of dawn, or often before it. Guards blew whistles and shouted commands. Prisoners rushed to dress, fumbling with stiff, frozen clothing. They joined the roll call outside, where frost bit exposed skin. If someone had died during the night, which happened often, their body was still counted, propped upright so the quota would be met. The introduction to camp rules was simple but brutal. Disobedience meant punishment. Slowing down meant punishment. Asking questions meant punishment. The camp functioned on a system designed to crush individuality and force obedience through fear. Guards did not see the prisoners as human beings. They saw them as expendable labor parts of a machine designed to extract resources from some of the harshest environments on Earth. And yet, even during those first days, not everything was defined by cruelty. Within the barracks, prisoners sought fragments of humanity wherever they could. Older prisoners explained how things worked, where to stand during roll call, how to fold blankets, how to stretch meager rations. A small gesture, sharing half a piece of bread, offering space on a bunk, could mean the difference between despair and faint hope. In a place intended to erase all compassion, the smallest kindness became an act of resistance. Fear, however, remained constant. The guards' footsteps on gravel, the barking of dogs, the sudden shout of an order, these sounds sent immediate ripples through the camp. No one ever felt safe. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Eyes turned downward. People learned to speak without moving their lips, to communicate through nods and glances, always cautious. For new arrivals, the most difficult adjustment wasn't physical pain, hunger, or cold, although all of these were relentless. The hardest thing to endure was the realization that normal life was gone. Letters came rarely, if at all. News about the outside world was scarce. Many prisoners didn't even know whether their families believed they were alive. Days blended together into a gray blur. Time itself became strange, stretching endlessly forward yet disappearing behind them as if swallowed by snow. The authorities promised that the camps were places of re-education. In reality, they were places of exploitation. Forced labor camps where prisoners were expected to build railroads across frozen ground, chop trees in sub-zero temperatures, and dig canals with tools barely more advanced than those used centuries earlier. This truth was whispered through the barracks as a warning to newcomers. The Gulag wasn't a temporary punishment. It was a battle against exhaustion, against weather, against the system itself fought every single day. The psychological impact was immense. Many prisoners described the first week as the most dangerous period, not because of guards, but because of despair. People who believed they would never make it simply gave up, emotionally and physically. They stopped fighting to stay warm, stopped conserving their strength, stopped hoping. The camp swallowed them quickly. Others clung to whatever reasons for living they could find: family, faith, memory. A promise made to themselves. They repeated names in their heads so they wouldn't forget. They imagined returning home even if the thought seemed impossible. They learned to adapt, not to accept the system as just, but to survive within it. And survival required understanding unwritten rules. Don't draw attention. Save your strength. Never show all of your food at once. Be cautious in whom you trust. Avoid conflict unless absolutely necessary. Learn to work just hard enough to avoid punishment, but not so hard that you collapse. Every choice mattered. Every step carried risk. Despite the cruelty, humanity lingered like small embers struggling against the wind. Prisoners shared stories at night, telling each other about childhoods, cities, fields, and oceans they remembered. They spoke about music, food, laughter, normal things that felt almost unreal inside the camp. These memories weren't just nostalgia. They were anchors, tying them to an identity the system tried to erase. Even in this cold, controlled world, acts of quiet courage appeared. Someone smuggled scraps of paper to record names of the dead. Someone carved religious symbols from wood, hiding them where only trusted eyes could see. Someone risked punishment to pass messages from one barrack to another. Each act said the same silent thing: we existed. We mattered. We will not let this place erase us completely. The first days were a harsh initiation. Prisoners learned that suffering was routine, that hope had to be managed carefully. Too much hope could break you when reality struck back. Too little hope would extinguish your will to live. The Gulag forced people to balance between despair and determination, between obedience and quiet resistance. Those who endured the arrival phase entered the next stage, the long, grinding life of the camp itself. What awaited them was work, punishment, hunger, disease, and endless winter. Yet the memory of arrival lingered like a scar. That first realization that the outside world had vanished, that the system had swallowed them whole, it stayed with prisoners for years. The Gulag was many things: a prison, a labor camp, a weapon of political repression, and a monument to unchecked power, but above all, it was a warning carved not into stone, but into memory. It shows what happens when fear rules a nation, when leaders view their own people as threats, and when human lives become expendable tools in the pursuit of ideology. And for every person who walked through those gates, life was divided into 2 chapters before the Gulag and after. Even those who survived would never fully escape the echoes of their arrival. The sound of the barred gates closing, the wind slicing across open ground, the realization that the world behind them had disappeared into darkness, and that a different world, cold, silent, endless, had taken its place. The train slowed, then rattled forward again, as if uncertain whether to stop or continue. For the prisoners inside, time had already lost its meaning. They tried counting the hours by the intervals between the guards' shouts or by the rare moments when the doors creaked open, but eventually the rhythm of the journey blurred into one continuous ordeal. It felt as if the train wasn't just moving across the country. It felt as though it was carrying them out of the world they knew and into another reality entirely, one where nothing familiar existed. Inside each car, the air was thick and stale. The small barred vents near the ceiling were meant to provide ventilation, but they mostly let in only the sharpest blasts of winter. Breath condensed into clouds, then turned into droplets, and finally into frost that clung to the wood. Every movement scraped against something: metal chains, rough boards, boots against the floor. People tried to shift positions to relieve the numbness in their legs, but there was nowhere to go. Bodies pressed together, strangers forced into intimacy by circumstance, sharing warmth not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Some whispered quietly, others stared blankly at nothing, and there were those who tried to pray, mouthing words silently, afraid to be noticed. The train was a waiting room between one fate and another, a place where every thought revolved around a single question: what awaits us at the end of this journey? From time to time, a guard would slide open a small hatch and peer inside. His eyes would sweep across the crowded car with an expression that was not hatred exactly, but something colder: indifference. The kind of indifference that comes when people stop seeing other people as human beings. Orders were barked, sometimes for no reason at all, just to remind those inside the train who held power. A silence followed each shout, as if the prisoners collectively inhaled and decided it was safer not to exhale too loudly. When night fell, darkness consumed everything. There were no lamps, no flickers of light, only the faint outlines of faces and hands illuminated by reflected snow when the train passed near open land. Sounds became louder in the darkness: the steady clack of the rails, the distant howling of wind, the occasional cough that seemed to echo much longer than it should. Someone cried once, a young woman whose voice trembled with exhaustion, but another voice quietly urged her to stop, not unkindly, but urgently. Tears might attract attention, and attention could become punishment. The smell inside the car changed as days passed. Hunger had a scent, an emptiness mixed with sweat, fear, and the sourness of unwashed bodies. Buckets in the corners overflowed despite the prisoners' attempts to keep some order. When the doors opened briefly at stations or remote outposts, the shock of fresh air stabbed into their lungs like knives, but it also brought brief relief. Some prisoners leaned as close as they dared to the opening, desperate to fill their lungs with clean, cold air before it disappeared again. The guards shouted, and the doors slammed shut. Food was rationed with ruthless precision: a ladle of watery soup, a thin slice of bread. There were moments when a guard would carelessly spill a drop of soup onto the wood, and eyes followed that drop as though it were gold. A few brave souls licked crumbs from their palms. Others tucked half their bread inside their clothing, planning to save it for later, though everyone understood the risk. If discovered, it could be stolen, confiscated, or used as an excuse for punishment. Still, some held on anyway, because possessing food meant possessing a little control over life. During these long journeys, people learned things about themselves they never wanted to know. They discovered how long they could go without sleep, how deeply fear could embed itself beneath the skin, how easily the mind could drift toward despair. But they also discovered a strange, fragile resilience. They found out they could keep standing even when their legs trembled. They learned how to share tiny scraps without anyone noticing. They learned to listen without speaking, to comfort without drawing attention. When the train finally slowed again, more decisively this time, people sensed that something had changed. The wheels screeched, sparks flew, and the whole car shuddered. Voices rose in hushed tones. Some craned their necks toward the door, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of where they were. Others simply closed their eyes and whispered silent goodbyes to places and people they might never see again. The doors opened to reveal a world of stark whiteness. Snow spread in every direction, broken only by dark lines of trees and the rigid shapes of guard towers looming like watchful sentinels. The air rushed into the car in a violent gust, filling lungs with a cold so intense that it made people gasp involuntarily. Guards shouted orders, prisoners stumbled forward, blinking against the brightness. The sky seemed impossibly large, indifferent, and endless. They were herded off the train and into lines. Some carried their small bundles. Others clutched at coats that barely shielded them from the wind. Their feet sank into snow that came up to their shins. The cold crept through fabric, through skin, finding every weakness. A few collapsed, either from exhaustion or shock, and were dragged to their feet again with little ceremony. The world here had no patience. Ahead of them, through the haze of blowing snow, the camp slowly revealed itself. Barbed wire fences formed hard, unforgiving boundaries around a cluster of crude wooden structures. Watchtowers stood at each corner, with silhouettes of guards perched inside them, rifles in hand. Dogs barked, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Somewhere nearby, metal clanged against metal, a reminder that work, constant and relentless, was the purpose of this place. As the prisoners approached the gate, the symbolism hit them with full force. It was not just an entrance. It was a threshold, a line between one existence and another. Many felt an overwhelming sense that whatever identity they had brought with them as teachers, farmers, students, parents, soldiers would not survive once they crossed that gate. The prison system did not care who they were before. It cared only what they could endure now. The gate creaked open, and the prisoners shuffled inside. The creak became a sound they would never forget. It echoed in their memories long after, like a warning bell announcing that the old world had officially ended. Beyond the gate, guards directed them toward a makeshift processing area. Forms were filled out, names checked, mistakes made and rarely corrected. Then, almost casually, numbers were assigned, a number on a tag, a number on a list, a number that would replace their name in conversations, punishments, and records. Personal belongings were confiscated with near-scientific detachment. Rings slipped off fingers that had swollen from cold. Photographs were taken, examined for a second, then tossed aside as if they meant nothing. A scarf knitted by a mother, a Bible, a notebook full of poems, all were labeled contraband or unnecessary. With each item taken, prisoners felt parts of themselves stripped away, as though they were being reduced to something simpler, something easier to control. Uniforms were issued next, thin coats with missing buttons, trousers patched so many times that the original fabric was barely visible, boots several sizes too big or painfully too small. Prisoners stuffed rags into their shoes to keep them on. Some tried to roll up sleeves that drooped past their hands. None of it mattered. The clothing was not meant for comfort. It was meant for uniformity. They were guided to the barracks, trudging through paths carved into the snow by countless feet before them. Inside, the smell of damp wood and smoke filled their nostrils. The heat from small iron stoves barely reached the corners of the room. Bunks were assigned quickly. Top bunks were cold, bottom bunks were damp, middle bunks were considered a blessing by comparison. Blankets were thin and smelled of age. People sat on their assigned beds, unsure whether they should feel relief that the journey had ended or terror that something even worse was about to begin. For many, the first shock was not the harshness of the conditions, but the realization that there was no clear end in sight. The rattle of the train had at least suggested movement. Here, everything felt frozen: time, landscape, fate. Outside, snowdrifts piled against the walls. Inside, people huddled around the stove, stretching out their hands toward the flames, even though the heat barely warmed their palms. That first night in the camp was different from any other night they had known. Sleep did not come easily. Some cried quietly, their faces buried in their hands so the guards would not see. Others lay motionless, staring into the darkness, replaying every event that led them there. There were those who still believed a mistake had been made and that someone, somewhere, would correct it soon. And there were those who had already understood the truth. Mistakes were seldom corrected here. The next morning, reality arrived long before dawn. A whistle blew, sharp and shrill. Commands echoed across the yard. Prisoners scrambled out of their bunks, their movements clumsy with exhaustion. They rushed to dress, pulling on stiff boots and frozen jackets. Outside, the wind lashed at their faces. One by one, they assembled for roll call, standing in straight lines as guards paced back and forth, counting, recounting, and shouting if anyone moved. If a prisoner had died during the night, their body did not leave the line. It was held upright, propped against another prisoner, or simply left standing, frozen in the same position it had taken in death. The system cared more about numbers than lives. And the prisoners watched, numb with horror, as the reality of their new existence settled over them like another layer of frost. The introduction to camp life continued with instructions that were brutally simple: obey, work, do not question. Punishments were explained not as threats, but as facts: isolation cells, reduced rations, extra labor, beatings. The tone was clinical, almost bored, as if these were ordinary administrative details. And perhaps, in the logic of the camp, they were. Yet amid the shock and the fear, something unexpected appeared: patterns of quiet adaptation. Older prisoners, who had survived months or years already, began offering whispered advice to the newcomers. Stand where the wind is weakest during roll call. Wrap cloth around your hands beneath your gloves. Hide half your bread immediately and eat the other half slowly. Never be the first to volunteer. Never be the last to move when ordered. These tips were not meant to inspire courage. They were meant to increase the odds of survival by a fraction. During the rare moments when they were allowed to rest inside the barracks, the new arrivals listened. They listened to stories about quotas, about work sites far beyond the camp, about punishments and rare privileges. They listened to warnings about which guards could be reasoned with and which ones seemed to enjoy cruelty. They listened because listening meant learning, and learning meant living. As the days passed, the initial shock transformed into a heavy, persistent awareness. The camp was not temporary. It was not a brief stop on the way to justice. It was a world with its own rules, its own rhythms, its own brutal hierarchy. Prisoners began to recognize familiar faces: the guard who never smiled, the old prisoner who shuffled when he walked, the criminal inmate who always stood near the food line. Slowly, painfully, the unfamiliar became routine, but the emotional wound of arrival, of being processed, stripped, numbered, and contained, never quite healed. It became part of every prisoner's story, a memory that lived beneath every experience that followed. When newcomers arrived in the future, those who had already endured their own arrival felt something shift inside them. They saw themselves reflected in the frightened eyes of others. And in that reflection lay a terrible realization. This cycle would continue over and over as long as the system demanded more labor, more bodies, more silence. So the prisoners learned to carry on, not because they accepted the injustice, but because survival demanded it. They worked, they waited, they endured the relentless cold and the constant feeling of being watched. They told themselves small stories, made small promises, found small reasons to wake up each day. Somewhere in the distance, life outside the camp continued unseen, unreachable, almost unimaginable, and all the while the memory of those first days, the train, the gate, the shock of the wind, the loss of identity, remained etched into their minds. It marked the point where their old lives ended and their struggle in the Gulag truly began. It was the moment when they stepped not into a prison with walls and cells, but into a complete system designed to reshape them, to diminish them, and above all, to remind them that in this frozen world, weakness was dangerous, hope was fragile, and survival was never guaranteed. The first night in the barracks was a lesson in the hierarchy of survival. The new arrivals were shoved toward the worst bunks, the lower boards near the drafty door, or the damp corner where snowmelt sometimes seeped through. The upper bunks, closer to what little warmth drifted upward, were already claimed by the veterans of the camp, prisoners who had learned how to negotiate favors, how to steal unnoticed, or how to curry favor with guards and foremen. These men weren't stronger, necessarily. They were simply more adapted to the cruel mathematics of the Gulag: space, food, warmth, protection. Everything had a price, and everything could be traded. The barracks stank of sweat, unwashed clothing, and the sour odor of thin cabbage soup that had soaked into the wood from countless spilled bowls. A single iron stove stood in the center of the building, glowing only faintly. The stove was not meant to warm anyone. It existed to maintain the illusion of heat, a symbol rather than a solution. In winter, ice sometimes formed on the inside walls. Prisoners woke with frost clinging to their eyelashes and breath freezing in thin, pale clouds. Sleep itself was never truly restful. Men coughed, muttered, cried out in nightmares, or tossed restlessly from hunger aches gnawing at their stomachs. Rats scurried across the floor and occasionally over the bodies of those too weak to brush them away. There were always whispers, trades being negotiated, secrets shared, rumors about upcoming inspections or punishment brigades. And somewhere in the dark, somebody counted every crumb of bread they had saved, terrified of being robbed before morning. Food was the defining measure of existence. Officially, prisoners received rations. In reality, rations were a form of discipline. Work harder, fulfill the impossible quota, and maybe you'd receive a few extra grams of bread. Fail to meet the quota, fall behind, collapse, and the ration shrank. Less bread meant weaker bodies meant falling further behind. Eventually, the system consumed those who could no longer feed it. The morning meal was usually nothing more than thin gruel, floating with a few sad pieces of barley husk or boiled weeds. Bread was black, heavy, and sometimes filled with sawdust to stretch the flour. Men treasured it like treasure. Prisoners divided their ration with near scientific precision. Some devoured all of it immediately, unable to resist. Others wrapped their portion in scraps of cloth, tucking it under their shirt or even inside their boot, saving it for the moment when despair hit hardest. But saving bread was also dangerous. Someone always watched, always calculated, always waited for the right time to steal. Work began before sunrise. The guards marched the prisoners out in columns, their boots crunching across ice or sinking into mud depending on the season. The guards were usually poorly trained conscripts, hardened not by principle but by bitterness. Many were barely older than the prisoners they oversaw, yet the uniform gave them license to treat human beings as livestock. Insults, shoves, and beatings were constant. The prisoners were numbers, not names. A man could disappear, and his absence would barely ripple across the frozen horizon. The work itself varied: logging in the forests, digging canals, hauling stone, building railways through wilderness, mining in permafrost. Tasks were deliberately brutal, designed less for efficiency and more for punishment. Tools were rudimentary: dull saws, splintered shovels, axes with loose heads. Gloves were rare, coats threadbare. Frostbitten fingers cracked and bled, toes blackened and died unnoticed until the stench gave them away. Each man was tied to a quote, to a number scrawled on a clipboard by an indifferent foreman: cut this many logs, move this many cubic meters of earth, shaft this much coal. Failure was not simply reprimanded, it meant less food. Less food meant death slowly approaching, each day drawing closer. There was something terrifyingly mathematical about it. Survival became a calculation, a race against a number that never cared who you were or what you had once been. Among the prisoners, different groups formed naturally. There were political prisoners, teachers, doctors, engineers, writers, peasants who had resisted grain requisitions, men who had made offhanded jokes or simply been accused by someone desperate to save themselves. Many still carried themselves with a sense of dignity, as if clinging to their former lives gave meaning to the present suffering. Beside them were hardened criminals, thieves, bandits, repeat offenders. These men often dominated the barracks, controlling trade and intimidation like a shadow government sanctioned by the guards. In many camps, the guards deliberately empowered them, using them as tools to keep the rest in check. This internal class war bred tension. Political prisoners spoke quietly among themselves, debating ideology, remembering books, reciting poetry from memory like sacred texts. The criminals laughed at them. In the harsh ecosystem of the Gulag, principles were luxuries. Everything that wasn't directly tied to immediate survival seemed naive. Yet even among the most desperate circumstances, moments of humanity somehow persisted. When someone collapsed during work, another prisoner sometimes risked losing rations to help him stand. A stolen potato might be split 3 ways. A scrap of newspaper, smuggled from somewhere, could become a treasure read and reread until the paper dissolved. At night, someone might recount stories of home, describing ordinary meals, family gatherings, warm kitchens, in such vivid detail that listeners could almost feel the warmth, until the reality of the barracks returned. Punishment was always nearby. Infractions, real or imagined, led to solitary confinement, known grimly as the box. Prisoners placed inside were barely given food, almost no clothing, and had to endure bitter cold or suffocating heat, depending on the season. Some returned broken, others never returned at all. Rumors circulated constantly about men being taken for questioning and vanishing forever. Sickness swept through the camp like a shadow. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia each thrived among malnutrition and filth. Medical facilities, if they existed, were primitive. Prison doctors, often prisoners themselves, could do little more than offer advice and scraps of medicine. The so-called hospital did provide one temporary benefit: reduced work. But beds there were few, and access highly controlled. Some prisoners feigned illness, hoping for a brief respite. Others hid symptoms, afraid they would simply be marked as useless and discarded. As seasons changed, the landscape itself seemed to conspire against those trapped within it. In winter, the land froze into an endless white desert. In summer, swarms of mosquitoes filled the air, biting through thin clothing and leaving raw welts. Mud swallowed boots. The sun barely set, eroding any sense of time. Every day blurred into the next. The march, the labor, the thin soup, the cold nights, the constant fear. Despite everything, There were those who refused to surrender their inner world. Men composed imaginary letters to loved ones, repeating the words silently to preserve memory. Others carved tiny figures from scraps of wood. Some prayed, even when faith itself could be considered an act of rebellion. They clung to the hope fragile, flickering that the outside world still existed, that someone somewhere remembered their name. Yet for many, the camp reshaped reality. New prisoners arrived, exhausted and stunned, repeating the same questions. How long will this last? Will anyone ever leave? The older inmates rarely answered directly. They simply shrugged, as if time had lost meaning. Sentences of 5, 10, or 20 years were abstractions, overshadowed by the daily battle against hunger and cold. For some, the Gulag had become their only world, a world governed not by law, but by fear, numbers, and scarcity. At night, when the guards locked the barracks and the murmur of voices slowly faded, there were moments of eerie silence. The vast Siberian wilderness stretched in every direction, endless forests, frozen rivers, mountains distant and indifferent. Escape was theoretically possible. Practically, it meant death by exposure, starvation, or wolves long before reaching any sign of civilization. Stories circulated about those who tried, bodies found frozen in the snow, or footprints disappearing into the forest, never seen again. Hope, when misapplied, could be fatal. Even so, the human mind sought meaning. Some prisoners told themselves that they were witnesses to history, that enduring this ordeal meant participating in something larger, even if that something was monstrous. Others withdrew into numbness, shutting down feelings to survive another day without breaking. Life in the camp was not one dramatic event followed by another. Rather, it was an accumulation of small degradations, the hunger pang that became normal, the beating that went unremembered, the friend who grew quieter each day, and then simply wasn't there one morning. These little losses formed the rhythm of existence, as relentless as the sound of saws biting into frozen timber. And through it all, the Gulag system continued to function like a vast machine, indifferent and self-sustaining. Trains kept arriving, quotas kept rising, reports were filed, statistics compiled, and somewhere far away, officials congratulated themselves on productivity numbers while men froze in forests they would never leave. For the prisoners living inside this reality, survival hinged on a delicate balance, protecting one's ration, avoiding unnecessary attention, forging quiet alliances, and preserving some fragment of self-respect. Every day was a negotiation, how far to bend without breaking, how much to endure without losing the will to live. And for many, the quiet realization grew: the Gulag wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a deliberate experiment in crushing the human spirit to see how much suffering a person could endure before forgetting who they had once been. The longer a prisoner stayed in the camp, the more he understood that punishment wasn't merely a response to disobedience. It was a language, a system of signals meant to remind everyone that they were owned. It was the invisible hand shaping behavior, forcing obedience even when the guards weren't looking. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every delay in stepping into formation could be interpreted as defiance. And defiance, whether imagined or real, required demonstration. Someone had to pay, if only to keep everyone else afraid. The punishments varied, sometimes arbitrary and sometimes ritualized. A prisoner might be ordered to stand for hours in the bitter, cold without gloves or hat, as wind sliced across his face like tiny knives. Another might be forced to dig a pit only to fill it back in, repeating the senseless task until his muscles trembled. There was no logic except subjugation, no purpose except to erode the idea that effort should lead to meaning. In the Gulag, exhaustion itself became a sentence. Then there was the punishment brigade, a work group assigned impossible quotas with intentionally inadequate tools. Men sent there were practically being signed over to slow execution. Their bodies wasted faster, their rations shrank quicker, their names faded sooner. One could see it in their eyes, the dullness, the resignation, the way hope slipped away like breath in cold air. Sometimes they marched back from work as a skeletal line, missing one or two faces that had fallen in the snow and simply been swallowed by silence. What terrified prisoners most was not always the brutality, but the randomness. One day, a guard might joke with a prisoner, accepting a cigarette or tolerating a minor mistake. The next day, that same guard would beat someone senseless for no clear reason at all. The message was clear: nothing was predictable, and therefore nothing was safe. You could follow every rule and still find yourself dragged to the commandant's office, accused of laziness, sabotage, or disrespect, words that could reshape your fate overnight. Inside that small office, beneath portraits of distant leaders whose names the prisoners whispered with weary bitterness, everything depended on the moods of men who had long ceased to see prisoners as human beings. Signed papers meant additional years. Silence or sarcasm could be interpreted however the officials wished. There was rarely any defense worth giving. The accusation was already the verdict. All that remained was the degree of suffering attached. The solitary cell remained one of the most feared punishments. The box, often built of thin planks with cracks that let in wind and insects, felt like a coffin turned upright. There was barely enough room to sit. At night, cold seeped into bone. Prisoners counted hours by their own breath. Some tried to recite memories, songs, or prayers, clinging desperately to words so they wouldn't unravel. Others scratched marks into the wood, inventing calendars that quickly dissolved into confusion. Time in the box stretched into something monstrous, neither day nor night, neither full consciousness nor sleep. And when prisoners emerged, blinking back into the world of barracks and labor lines, even suffering among others felt strangely like relief. The guards understood the value of humiliation as well. Public punishment wasn't only about the victim, it was theater. They lined up prisoners to witness beatings, forcing them to stand still while blows fell. Each crack of the baton sent a shiver of dread through the entire group. "This could be you," the spectacle whispered. "This could be any of you at any moment." Sometimes the victim was guilty of an infraction. Sometimes he was simply unlucky enough to be chosen as the example of the weak. It was during those moments that the psychological divide among prisoners became easiest to see. Some stared fixedly at the ground, willing themselves not to show emotion. Anger, pity, disgust, any visible reaction could be interpreted as solidarity and lead to punishment. Others watched everything closely, calculating, studying which guards were cruelest, which prisoners broke and which endured. Some criminals smirked, quietly pleased when political prisoners were humiliated. In their eyes, it reaffirmed their place. In the upside-down world of the camps, brutality could be a form of currency. Yet beneath the layers of manipulation and fear, there still existed a fragile, almost secret economy of resistance, not the loud kind that slogans celebrate, but the quiet, stubborn kind that survives simply by refusing to vanish internally. Resistance might mean sharing a warning about an upcoming inspection. It could mean hiding a sick comrade during roll call so he might slip into the infirmary later. Sometimes it meant nothing more than refusing to laugh when the guards demanded amusement, a silent assertion that even humiliation had limits. Those who carried stories inside them became important. The professors, novelists, teachers, or priests, they became living libraries. At night, in voices barely above whispers, they reconstructed novels from memory, recited entire chapters, debated philosophical questions, or told histories that the regime tried to erase. For a few minutes at a time, men seated on rough wooden boards traveled far beyond barbed wire, to cities they had never seen, to ancient battles, to fictional worlds. This mental escape did not change rations or erase cold, but it strengthened something intangible, the sense that there was still a world beyond the camp, still a life worth remembering. Not everyone appreciated such conversations. Some prisoners dismissed them as fantasies, distractions that dulled the sharp edge of survival. One thief famously snarled that stories could not be traded for bread, and he was right in a brutally practical sense. But he failed to see that without such fragile illusions, the soul risked starving faster than the body. Letters, when they occasionally arrived, were both blessing and torment. Censors blacked out entire phrases, leaving jagged scars of ink across sentences. A short message might take months to reach the camp, and even longer for a reply to leave. Sometimes news of a death at home arrived too late for grief to find context. Other times, a letter spoke of children growing up, of fields changing with seasons, of a life continuing without the prisoner. These reminders could weaken a man, or they could steady him, giving meaning to every day endured. The cruelest fate belonged to those who received nothing at all. Silence could crush a person more thoroughly than punishment ever could. There were moments when morale across the camp dipped collectively, as if everyone felt an invisible pressure at once. A particularly brutal winter, a new commandant with a reputation for cruelty, rumors of war, losses, or political purges beyond the fences. On such days, the atmosphere thickened, conversations shortened, faces tightened. Men trudged through routines not out of hope, but out of inertia. Survival became mechanical, one foot, one step, one shallow breath after another. Death rarely arrived dramatically. It came quietly, slipping unnoticed into tired bodies. A prisoner might cough persistently one week, grow weaker the next, and then one morning fail to rise from his bunk. Those around him lifted his thin form carefully, not out of ceremony, but out of a weary understanding that the dead deserved at least a minimal dignity. The camp had routines for such things, a number recorded, a blanket wrapped, a brief gap in the rows before labor resumed. Sometimes someone murmured a prayer. Sometimes silence was the only farewell. The cruel irony was that the Gulag depended on the very people it destroyed. The system consumed lives to build railways, dams, mines, monuments that later generations might pass without knowing the human cost buried beneath the foundations. For the authorities, prisoners became statistics, productivity reports, quotas achieved. For the men who endured the work, those same projects were scars across the landscape, reminders that their suffering had been transformed into cold infrastructure. Relationships within the camp were volatile and complicated. Friendships formed unexpectedly, two men from entirely different worlds discovering a shared love of music, or a similar childhood memory, or simply recognizing a familiar loneliness in one another. But friendship was risky. Attachments invited pain when death or transfers inevitably took someone away. Still, some held on to these fragile bonds because they made them feel human again. Trust, however, was always dangerous. Informants existed everywhere, prisoners who traded secrets for favors, reduced sentences, or scraps of extra food. The threat of betrayal hovered constantly, poisoning conversations. A casual remark about a guard, an expression of bitterness, a whispered complaint, any of these could end up quoted in an interrogation room. And yet, despite the risk, people spoke anyway. To stay completely silent for years was its own form of madness. Some prisoners turned inward, constructing elaborate inner lives. They built imaginary houses, furnished them in their thoughts, invited remembered loved ones to sit by non-existent fireplaces. Others replayed old arguments or conversations, trying to rewrite outcomes in their minds. A few, exhausted by hope and memory, surrendered to apathy, walking through each day like a ghost, neither resisting nor fully participating. These were often the ones who vanished first, not necessarily physically, but psychologically. Their eyes lost focus, their voices became monotone, they were present, yet already gone. Religion, though officially condemned, never fully disappeared. Men carved makeshift crosses, whispered forbidden prayers, or improvised ceremonies for the dead. Some believed that suffering purified the soul. Others questioned a universe that allowed such cruelty. In the hush before lights out, quiet murmurs sometimes rippled through the barracks, not defiant, not loud, but steady, like the last embers of a fire refusing to die. Occasionally, rumors of amnesty or shorter sentences would surge through the camp like a sudden strong wind. Prisoners clung to them desperately, analyzing every whispered detail, constructing elaborate timelines in their minds. Days later, when the rumors dissolved into nothing, the collapse of hope felt physically painful. And yet, within weeks, another rumor would take its place. Hope, even false hope, was addictive. The guards themselves were not all identical. Some were truly cruel men who seemed to derive pleasure from pain, whose eyes hardened at the sight of weakness. Others were simply trapped in their roles, afraid to show leniency because leniency could be seen as ideological weakness. A rare few occasionally slipped an extra ladle of soup to a sick prisoner or pretended not to notice a minor infraction. The system did not encourage kindness, but neither could it erase every trace of humanity. Still, prisoners learned never to rely on it. Mercy, when it came, was unpredictable. As seasons turned again, the rhythms of punishment, work, and fear threaded themselves into an almost unbearable normalcy. Men accustomed themselves to constant vigilance, checking every word and movement, measuring distance from guards, weighing every decision on a scale that balanced survival against self-respect. It was a slow erosion, the kind that didn't break people in one dramatic moment, but wore them down grain by grain, and beneath it all lay a question that haunted almost everyone: who will I be if I survive this? Some feared they would emerge hardened, unable to love or trust. Others worried they would forget that the world outside would move on and the Gulag would vanish into a vague memory, leaving no trace of those who never returned. A few nurtured the opposite dream, that one day truth would matter and stories like theirs would finally be told instead of buried beneath propaganda and silence. Until then, they endured, one endless day after another, carrying the invisible scars of punishment marks not always left on skin, but carved deep into the mind. And far beyond the fences, in towns and cities where ordinary life continued, most people had no idea of the universe of suffering hidden in the remote wilderness, a place where time slowed, names disappeared, and the value of a human being could be measured in grams of bread and hours worked in freezing wind. Yet even there, in what seemed like the darkest corners of history, something fragile persisted, a quiet refusal to fully surrender the inner self. The camp could break bodies, humiliate, starve, and crush, but it struggled to erase entirely the stubborn spark that whispered, "You are more than this, remember." And that whispered memory, fragile, flickering, sometimes barely there at all, became the thin line separating those who merely existed from those who still, in spite of everything, somehow lived. By the time months slid into years, something began to shift inside the prisoners, not in a sudden revelation, but in a slow accumulation of thoughts that returned again and again like a tide. The question was no longer simply how to survive the next day, but what survival would even mean. A man could endure hunger, cold, humiliation, and fear, but what would be left afterward? Would the world outside recognize him, or worse, would he recognize himself? There were moments when the prisoners tried to remember their old lives and found the images fading, like photographs left too long in the sun. A teacher tried to recall his classroom, but his students' faces dissolved into vague outlines. A musician hummed fragments of melodies but could not remember entire songs. A father pictured his children, yet the children grew older in dreams faster than in memory. The camp had a way of stealing not only time, but identity, eroding the past slowly until it felt unreal. Yet it was precisely because of this erosion that many men clung desperately to ritual. Even the smallest personal habit, washing one's face with a handful of snow, folding a blanket neatly, whispering the same thought every morning, became a thread tying them to who they once were. These rituals did not change their conditions. They changed how they faced them. They were declarations, quiet and stubborn. I am still a person. Hope arrived in strange forms. Sometimes it was nothing more than a rumor carried from camp to camp, a change in leadership, whispers of amnesty, the possibility of sentence reductions. These rumors fluttered like fragile birds, often crushed quickly by reality, but for a short while they warmed conversations. Men discussed future plans with cautious excitement, what they would eat first, whom they would visit, where they might live. Then, when the rumors faded, disappointment washed over them like a cold wave. The pain of crushed hope could feel worse than the steady dullness of despair, but hope that was tied to distant promises proved unreliable. So many prisoners gradually learned to look inward instead. They began to find meaning not in future fantasies, but in the daily decision not to surrender completely. Surviving became less about waiting for rescue and more about preserving dignity in small choices, refusing to betray a friend, sharing a secret smile, remaining honest even when dishonesty might bring advantage. In this way, ethics themselves became acts of resistance. There were those who dreamed of escape. The wilderness seemed endless but brutally seductive, forests stretching beyond sight, rivers cutting through frozen plains, mountains rising like barriers carved by nature itself. Men spoke in hushed tones about maps they imagined or remembered, about villages far beyond the fences where someone might give bread, shelter, directions. Stories circulated about escapees, one who supposedly reached the border, another who disguised himself as a guard, a third who walked for months. No one could confirm whether these stories were true. They became legends, half warning, half inspiration. Most prisoners knew the odds. The land itself was a prison. Snow erased tracks. Rivers froze treacherously. Wolves prowled, though hunger was often a greater predator. Even in summer, swamps swallowed feet, mosquitoes drained strength. To escape meant gambling not only with guards and dogs, but with nature. Many concluded silently that death beyond the fence was no different than death within, except that it would come alone. And yet, every so often, someone tried anyway, driven by a refusal so fierce that even certainty of failure could not extinguish it. Those left behind reacted with complex emotions when an escape attempt occurred. Some admired the courage, others called it foolish, especially if punishments followed. The guards always responded aggressively, increased inspections, harsher quotas, reduced rations. Collective punishment reminded everyone that freedom, even attempted freedom, came at a communal cost. So escape became both symbol and burden, simultaneously a source of pride and quiet resentment. As years passed, certain prisoners began to develop an uncanny sense of emotional distance. They spoke less about home, as if protecting themselves from the sharp sting of nostalgia. They stopped marking seasonal changes in their minds. Winter was simply colder work, summer merely different hardships. Birthdays went uncounted, anniversaries slipped away. Life collapsed into a loop of identical days, and the loop became their world. Yet for others, memory intensified instead of fading. They mentally replayed every family meal, every childhood street, the sound of particular footsteps in the hallway of their old house. They remembered the smell of bread, the creak of old furniture, the voices of neighbors. These memories grew sharper, almost painfully vivid. as if they feared that letting one detail slip would mean losing everything. At night, they visited familiar places in dreams, walking through streets that no longer existed or sitting at tables that had long been sold or destroyed. They returned from those dreams with tears dried into their cheeks, embarrassed but unable to stop. Letters, for those who still received them, became sacred relics. They were folded and unfolded until the paper thinned, read until the words nearly disappeared. Even censored messages carried emotion between the lines. A single phrase like "we are managing" or "we think of you often" had layers of meaning. Sometimes prisoners traced those words with their fingers, as if touch could bridge distance. When letters stopped coming, men constructed explanations: illness, postal delays, bureaucratic errors, anything to avoid the darker possibility that they had simply been forgotten. The camp also shaped how prisoners viewed one another. At first, differences in background mattered: the professor, the farmer, the soldier, the thief. But after enough winters, labels lost importance. Suffering stripped away illusions, revealing core traits: who could be trusted, who would steal, who would help others, who would harden into cruelty. Paradoxically, the Gulag both crushed individuality and exposed it. Under pressure, true character emerged, sometimes in astonishing ways. There were stories of generosity that seemed impossible in such conditions. A prisoner with a fever might awaken to find an extra scrap of bread tucked beneath his coat, anonymous, unclaimed. Another might discover that someone had quietly taken his shift carrying water. Once, a man who had saved his bread for days gave half away to someone who was clearly dying, knowing it made little logical sense. These gestures were small rebellions against a system designed to pit everyone against one another. Of course, not all acts were noble. Theft remained constant. Betrayal happened frequently, sometimes out of malice, more often out of desperation. Informants whispered names. Arguments erupted violently. Men who might once have lived ordinary, decent lives found themselves capable of acts they never would have imagined. Later, those who survived would carry an additional weight, not only the memory of harm done to them, but the guilt of what they had done to others in the name of survival. Religion and belief underwent transformation in the camp. Some lost faith entirely, convinced that any world capable of such cruelty could not possibly contain justice or compassion. Others experienced the opposite. Their belief deepened, stripped of ceremony, and reduced to simple, intimate conversations with the divine. A quiet prayer whispered in the cold night, a cross traced invisibly on the chest, a psalm recited from memory. These became lifelines. Faith did not always promise rescue. Instead, it promised meaning, and sometimes meaning was enough. In rare moments when tensions eased slightly, laughter resurfaced, brittle at first, then surprisingly warm. Prisoners told jokes about bureaucracy, about guards, even about themselves. Humor became a way of taking control, if only for a few seconds. A clever story shared quietly beneath a blanket could transform fear into something temporarily manageable. The ability to laugh at absurdity, to see the system's contradictions, its exaggerated rituals, became another survival tool. There were also intellectual refuges. A scientist lectured about astronomy using pebbles in the dirt to represent planets. A historian retold entire wars from memory. A poet composed verses silently and recited them during breaks, the words floating like fragile sparks across the icy air. These activities might have looked pointless from the outside, yet inside the camp they preserved the essential truth that human beings are more than laboring bodies. They reminded prisoners that knowledge, imagination, and creativity were realms untouched by barbed wire. The notion of time itself took on different meaning. Outside the camp, time moved forward: seasonal harvests, birthdays, elections, storms passing, children growing. Inside, time often circled, the same routine repeated until days blended into one long present. When someone mentioned that 5 years had passed, it felt unreal, as though the number belonged to another person's story. Some prisoners intentionally forgot how long they had been there, believing that counting would break them. Others etched small marks into hidden surfaces, insisting on bearing witness to every lost day. A deep exhaustion also settled in, not just physical exhaustion, but existential fatigue, the kind that made thinking feel heavy. Men sat in silence for hours, staring into space, not because they had nothing to say, but because words themselves seemed depleted. The only cure for such exhaustion was rest, but true rest did not exist in the camp. Sleep was crowded and cold, filled with interruptions. Dreams were often disturbing, replaying arrests or imagining scenes of freedom that dissolved upon waking like mist. Still, through cycles of hope and despair, one idea refused to die entirely, that someday, somehow, the truth would matter. It was a quiet belief, rarely spoken aloud. Many feared punishment even for entertaining it. Yet in the back of their minds, prisoners imagined a future world where people would read, listen, and finally understand what had happened in these remote camps. They pictured historians uncovering documents, children learning the names of forgotten prisoners, monuments rising over burial grounds. They imagined testimonies being told not in whispers, but openly. For some, this imagined future became a substitute for personal justice. Even if they never saw freedom themselves, maybe their suffering would not disappear entirely into silence. There were moments when the outside world seemed to intrude unexpectedly, reminding everyone that history continued beyond the fences. Guards spoke quietly about battles, political changes, new leaders. Sometimes rumors of war victories or defeats trickled in, reshaping the tone of the camp. A shift in political wind far away could suddenly alter sentences, relax discipline, or tighten restrictions overnight. Prisoners realized that although their world felt frozen, it was in fact fragile, ruled by decisions made by people who had never seen the camps at all. For those whose sentences neared their official end, anxiety intensified rather than easing. What awaited them beyond the gate? Would they be allowed to return home, or simply sent into permanent exile in the same remote region? Would their families accept them, or had years of propaganda turned loved ones into strangers? Some feared freedom as much as they longed for it. They had grown accustomed to structure, even cruel structure, and the open world with its endless choices seemed overwhelming. Others, especially those with impossibly long sentences or additional charges, faced an entirely different emotional challenge. They had to construct meaning within confinement itself, convincing themselves that life could still hold value even without the prospect of release. This required a kind of philosophical courage, the courage to live for reasons beyond reward. And then, occasionally, something extraordinary happened. Someone was actually released. The news always spread fast. Men gathered quietly after roll call, discussing every detail. What did he say? Was he thin, sick, changed? Did he believe the freedom was real or just another transfer? Had the guards treated him differently during his final days? The departure of one man jolted the psychological structure of the entire barracks. Suddenly, freedom was not only an idea, it had a face, a name, a recent memory. Those who left often promised to write, to tell others, to remember. Some likely did. Others, exhausted or fearful, may have remained silent once they reached the outside world. But the possibility that someone walked beyond the fence, stepping onto soil without a guard behind him, rekindled something unspoken in everyone else. The camp continued its rhythm: dawn, roll call, labor, thin soup, exhaustion, night. But under that rhythm pulsed the complexity of human resilience, the quiet strategies, the internal monologues, the fragile loyalties, the secret hopes and unspoken fears. The Gulag system aimed to transform living people into replaceable parts of a machine, but it could never fully erase the internal landscapes that each person carried, and that, perhaps, became the greatest paradox. Even as the prisoners' bodies weakened and their freedoms vanished, their minds, battered but unbroken, continued to travel beyond the fence. They dreamed, remembered, analyzed, imagined, feared, loved, doubted, believed. The system controlled their movements, but could only imperfectly control their thoughts. In that fragile, flickering territory, the quiet space inside the human spirit where meaning is decided, the prisoners carved out the one realm the Gulag could never fully conquer. When the day finally came, or rather, when it seemed to come, it arrived without ceremony. A guard called a name during roll call, as casually as he might announce a shift change. The prisoner whose name was spoken froze for a moment. He had heard enough rumors to know that a name